what to you is the connection between free will and consciousness, and is free will an illusion or not?
Good question. So I think we need to be a lot more agnostic about free will than about consciousness, because I don't think we have the kind of certainty of the existence of free will that we do have in the consciousness case. It could turn out that free will is an illusion. It feels as though we're free when we're really not. Whereas, I think the idea that nobody really feels pain, that we think we feel pain, but we do, that's a lot harder to make sense of. However, what I do feel strongly about is I don't think there are any good either scientific or philosophical arguments against the existence of free will. And I mean strong free will in what philosophers call libertarian free will, in the sense that some of our decisions are uncaused. So I very much do disagree with someone like Sam Harris, who thinks there's this overwhelming case. I just think it's non-existent. I think it's ultimately an empirical question, but as we've already discussed, I just don't think we know enough about the brain to establish one way or the other at the moment.
But we can build up intuitions. First of all, as a fan of Sam Harris, as a fan of yours, I would love to just listen.
Yeah.
Speaking about terminology, so one thing it would be beautiful to watch. Here's my prediction: what happens with you and Sam Harris? You talk for 4 hours, and Sam introduced that episode by saying it was ultimately not as fruitful as I thought, because here's what's going to happen: you guys are going to get stuck for the first 3 hours talking about one of the terms and what they mean. Sam is so good at this. I think it's really important, but sometimes you get stuck. Like, what does he say? Put a pin in that. He really gets stuck on the terminologies, which rightfully you have to get right in order to really understand what we're talking about. But sometimes you can get stuck with them for the entire conversation. It's a fascinating dance, the one we spoke to in philosophy. If you don't get the terms precise, you can't really be having the same conversation. But at the same time, it could be argued that it's impossible to get terms perfectly precise and perfectly formalized. So then you're also not going to get anywhere in the conversation. So it's a funny dance where you have to be both rigorous and every once in a while just let go, and then go back to being rigorous and formal, and then every once in a while let go. It's the difference between mathematics, the maths, and the poetry. Anyway, I'm
a big fan of Sam Harrison. I think we're on the same page in terms of consciousness. I think pretty much. I'm not saying he's a panpsychist, but in our understanding of the hard problem. But yeah, I think maybe we could talk about free will without being too dragged down in the terminology. But I don't know.
You said we need to be open-minded, but you could still have intuitions about. So Sam Harris has a pretty sort of counterintuitive, and for some reason it gets people really riled up, view of free will, that it's an illusion, or it's not even an illusion. Like it's not that the experience of free will is an illusion. He argues that we don't even experience any, like there's to say that we even have the experience is incorrect. That there's not even an experience of free will. It's pretty interesting that claim, and it feels like you can build up intuitions about what is right and not. There's been some kind of neuroscience, there's been some cognitive science and psychology experiments to sort of see, what is the timing and the origin of the desire to make an action, and when that action is actually performed, and how you interpret that action being performed, how you remember that action, like all the stories we tell ourselves, all the neurochemicals involved in making a thing happen, all of that. What's the timing, and how does that connect with us feeling like we decided to do something? And then, of course, there's the more philosophical discussion about is there room in a material view of the world for an entity that somehow disturbs the determinism of physics.
Yeah.
And yeah, those are all very precise questions. It's nice. It feels like free will is more amenable to like a physics mechanistic type of thinking than is consciousness to really get to the bottom of. It feels like if it was a race, if we're at a bar and we're betting money, it feels like we'll get to the bottom of free will faster than we will to the bottom of consciousness.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the comparison. Yeah, so there are different arguments here. I mean, so what one argument I've heard Sam Harris give that's pretty common in philosophy is this sort of thought that we can't make sense of a middle way between a choice being determined by prior causes and it just being totally random and senseless, like the random decay of radioactive isotope or something. So I think there was a good answer to that by the philosopher Jonathan Lowe, who's not necessarily very well known outside academic philosophy, but is a hugely influential figure. I think one of the best philosophers of recent times. He sadly died of cancer a few years ago. Actually spent almost all of his career at Durham University, where I am. So it was one reason it was a great honor to get a job there. But anyway, his answer to that was, what makes the difference between a free action and a totally senseless random event is that free choice involves responsiveness to reasons. So again, we were talking about this earlier. If I'm deciding whether to take a job in the US or to stay in the UK, I weigh up considerations, different standard of life maybe, or being close to family or cultural difference. I weigh them up and I, edge towards a decision. So I think that is sufficient to distinguish it. We're hypothetically supposing, trying to make sense of this idea, not saying it's real, but that could be enough to distinguish it from a senseless act. It's not a senseless random occurrence because the free decision involved responsiveness to reasons. So I think that just answers that particular philosophical objection. So what is the middle way between determined by prior causes and totally random? Well, there's a choice that's not determined by prior causes, but is not just random because the decision essentially involved responsiveness to reasons. So that's the answer to that. And I think actually that kind of thought also, I think you were hinting at the famous Libet experiments where he got his subjects to perform some kind of random action of pressing a button and then note the time they decided to press it, quote unquote. And then he's scanning the brains, and he claims to have found that about half a second before they consciously decided to press the button, the brain is getting ready to perform that action. So he claimed that about half a second before the person has consciously decided to press the button, the brain has already started the activity that's going to lead to the action. And then later people have claimed that there's a difference of maybe 7 to 10 seconds. I mean, there are all sorts of issues with these experiments. But one is that, as far as I'm aware, all of the quote-unquote choices they've focused on are just these totally random, senseless actions, like just pressing a button for no reason. And I think the kind of free will we're interested in is free choice that involves responsiveness to reasons, weighing up considerations. And those kind of free decisions might not happen like at an identifiable instant. You might, when you're weighing it up, should I get married? Should I, you might edge slowly towards one side or the other. And so it could be that maybe the Libet, I think there are other problems with the Libet stuff, but maybe they show that we can't freely choose to do something totally senseless, whatever that would mean. But that doesn't show we can't freely, in this strong libertarian sense, respond to considerations of reason and value. To be fair, it would be difficult to see what kind of experiment we could set up to test that, but just because we can't yet set up that kind of experiment, we shouldn't, pretend we know more than we do. So yeah, so for those reasons, the third consideration you raise is different. Again, this is the debate I have with Sean Carroll. Would this conflict with physics? I just think we don't know enough about the brain to know whether there are causal dynamics in the brain that are not reducible to underlying chemistry and physics. And So then Sean Carroll says, well, that would mean our physics is wrong. So he focuses on the core theory, which is the name for standard model of particle physics plus the weak limit of general relativity. So, we can't totally bring quantum mechanics and relativity together, but actually the circumstances in which we can't bring them together are just in situations of very high gravity. For example, when you're about to go into a black hole or something. Actually, in terrestrial circumstances, we can bring them together in the core theory. And then Sean wants to say, well, we can be very confident that core theory is correct. And so if there were libertarian free will in the brain, the core theory would be wrong. And okay, this is something I'm not sure about, and I'm still thinking about, and I'm learning from my discussion with Sean, but I'm still not totally clear why. It could be, suppose we did discover strong emergence in the brain, whether it's free will or something else. Perhaps what we would say is not that the core theory is wrong, but we'd say the core theory is correct in its own terms, namely capturing the causal capacities of particles and fields. But then it's a further assumption whether they're the only things that are running the show. Maybe there are also fundamental causal capacities associated with systems. Mm-hmm. And then if we discover this strong emergence, then when we work out what happens in the brain, we have to look to the core theory, the causal capacities of particles and fields, and we have to look to what we know about these strongly emergent causal capacities of systems, and maybe they co-determine what happens in the system. So I don't know whether that makes sense or not, but I mean, the more important point, that's in a way a kind of branding point, how we brand this. The more important point is we just don't know enough about the workings of the brain to know whether there are strongly emergent causal dynamics, whether or not that would mean we have to modify physics, or maybe just we think physics is not the total story of what's running the show, but we just, if it turned out empirically that everything's reducible to underlying physics and chemistry, sure, I would drop any commitment to libertarian free will in a heartbeat. It's an empirical question. Maybe that's why, as you say, it in principle is easier to get a grip on. But we're a million miles away from being at that stage.
Well, I don't know if we're a million miles. I hope we're not, because one of the ways I think to get to it is by engineering systems. So
yeah,
my hope is to understand intelligence by building intelligent systems, to understand consciousness by building systems that, let's say, the easy thing, which is not the easy thing, but the first thing, which is to try to create the illusion of consciousness. Through that process, I think you start to understand much more about consciousness, about intelligence. And then the same with free will. I think those are all tied very closely together, at least from our narrow human perspective. And when you try to engineer systems that interact deeply with humans, that form friends with humans, that humans fall in love with, and they fall in love with humans, then you start to have to try to deeply understand ourselves, to try to deeply understand what is intelligence in the human mind, what is consciousness, what is free will.